Greetings everybody, good evening on another cold, wet Melbourne night, and welcome to the PMI Victorian History Library. My name's Judith Ellis, and I'm President of the Library Board. And a very warm welcome to our guest here, David Kilderi. You're on my right. Known to many of you here, I'm sure. Our library is located on the lands of the Wurundjeri Woi-wurrung people of the Kulin Nation, and we pay our respects to their elders past and present. Sovereignty has never been ceded. It always was and always will be Aboriginal land. Just before I start with the main proceedings of today, I'll just mention a few admin things. Bathrooms, if you've not been here before, basically on the other side of that wall. So you can go through this door and turn left and they're there, or back through the door you came in through, do a U-turn, and it's on the other side of the wall. Emergency exits, we have two. One again is out of this door, turn right and go outside into the cold, wet Melbourne night, and back through the door bottom there, and again downstairs. But in the very unlikely event that there is an emergency, we'll make sure everybody gets out safely. Our library staff today, we've got Lauren and Ellen. Lauren's at the back there. She would have greeted you when you came in. And Ellen here is on our camera. They're taking photos and videos throughout the event, and that's for promotional purposes and also for viewing on our YouTube channel. So you can look at all these wonderful slides again later if you choose to, and anyone else can look at them too. So we've been here in Paran since 1854, 171 years old this year we are, and we're the second oldest public library in Victoria. We've got a collection of over 70,000 items in various formats, including digital formats, and we take great pride in being the sole library in Australia with such an extensive collection, which is available for loan. So you can actually take them, borrow them, and take them home. And our focus is very much on local history, housing a wealth of information about most towns across Victoria. Now, this is our annual Bruce Turner lecture, and that's in honour of Bruce Turner, who was the PMI's librarian back in the 1990s, and he oversaw the creation of this library as a specialist Victorian history library compared to what it had been before. So we're very happy to hold this event in his honour. On your seat, you've got a beautiful postcard, and these were designed by a Melbourne illustrator, James Tyrrell, I think his last name is. And you can find more of his works at Harper and Charlie, and that's also on the back of the postcard. It says where they're from. So we'd like to thank James very much for donating these postcards tonight. Very apt for the occasion and the theme. We also have display cases around the place with various artefacts in there from CATS, the Cinema and Theatre Historical Society, and we've also got news cuttings here from David, so you can have a look at those afterwards. And there's also books, some I think just at the entrance of the room here and some outside this room. So have a look at all of that if you haven't already. So now I'd like to welcome David Kilderi, as tonight's special speaker. David's been a member of CATS, the Cinema and Theatre Historical Society, for a long time, over 30 years, I believe, and is also a 20-year plus member of the Cinema Pioneers, including being a former branch president. David spent 43 years in cinemas and drive-ins, working for major chains and independents, including operating his own very successful theatre. Also, you have extensive experience, I understand, in radio and on television, in various documentaries and feature films as well, including one that many of you will know, The Lost City of Melbourne. So we're very delighted tonight to have someone who is just so interested and so expertise and specialist and knowledgeable about this area of Victorian cinemas and cinematography. Please make him welcome.
How's that? A little bit louder? Yeah. I've never been accused of being quiet, with or without a microphone. Thank you, Judith, for that very warm welcome. Thank you, everyone, for coming, and thanks to the rest of the PMI staff, Alan, Lauren, Jade, who I've been dealing with this presentation. And thanks for coming out on a cold, wet night. I've had to change my presentation at the very last moment. I had some wonderful tall tales to tell. Unfortunately, there's too many prominent cinema industry people here, so I'm going to have to tell the truth. There's Alan, there's Keith, there's Michael, there's Royce, there's several others here, so I'll try and stick to the truth. Mobile phones, I don't mind if they go off. I'll incorporate both the caller and the answerer into my presentation, so be my guest. We're going to start off with an apology. It's impossible for me to incorporate everyone's favourite suburban cinema in this presentation. Over the years, there's been literally hundreds in Melbourne, but I do have about 90 slides. We're going to move through them quite quickly, so hopefully I'll touch on at least something in your area or something that you might be familiar with. And I will throw some questions to the audience. Does anyone want to guess what that cinema is? No? Any other guesses?
West Coast, Coburg Progress Theatre.
No, it's not. I suddenly realised after I put this presentation together that I hadn't incorporated the cinema that was well known and that was closest to this very venue. That's the former Hoyt's Empress Paran. It was on Chapel Street, started off as vaudeville in 1913, a very early cinema, incorporated silent film, had its ups and downs over the years, and was about a mid-level Hoyt's location. So it was very popular with the action crowd, nowhere near as prestigious as the Hoyt's Regent South Yarra that was around the corner. All right, let's start moving through. First of all, some special thanks to Cats, the whole organisation, which I've been a member of for a long time, but particularly Royce Harris, who's here tonight and helped me with some photos. John Budge, who was doing what I did in the 80s and 90s and probably 70s as well, running around Melbourne, taking photos of old cinemas and drive-ins. Colin Hart, Morris Austin, Gordon Turnbull, John Brown, Harold Aspinall and George Florence. So most of the photos are either mine or John's or from the Cats archive. Okay, to get some perspective, we're going to be looking at the devastation that television wreaked upon the Melbourne suburban cinemas. But to understand the full story, we need to start off with some of the city theatres. Some of those numbers might be a little difficult to read, but 1950, there's 19 city cinemas in the CBD in Melbourne. 55, there's 21. 1960, there's 21. So that's 4 years after television was released, and the numbers are stable. Then in the mid-60s, they actually start going up. So the cinema business in the CBD was strong, and it remained strong. It was a destination, a special place for the family to go, a special place for couples to go. Of course, it had the first release films, and some of the cinemas were getting smaller. So they weren't the giant monster places that we had perhaps in the 30s and 40s. But by 1970, there's 29 individual screens in the CBD of Melbourne, and the first of the complexes opened, the Hoyt's Cinema Centre in 69. We'll have a quick look at just some of what I consider our three major picture palaces in the CBD. The Regent and Plaza, I took that shot late 80s, early 90s, when it was literally a derelict hulk. No furnishings, no seats, nothing inside, just a big wooden building on the floor. And of course, the plaza underneath was completely stripped out. One of the things that made me realise the love that Melburnians had for cinemas was when Cats ran a very early open day in the early 1990s. I think about 1992. We got permission from Melbourne City Council to open it to the public and lead guided tours. We expected perhaps a few hundred. We got thousands. That's me leading one of the tours. I think I was halfway through my first tour. They were to run an hour and I was to have 25 people. Jerry Kennedy, the late president of Cats, come running over to me halfway through and said, "David, you need to double the numbers and halve the time. We've got thousands lined up. There's 3,000 people lined up to Swanston Street." So that really illustrated the love that Melburnians had for our cinema heritage. The second of Melbourne's grand picture palaces, the Capitol, Swanston Street, still sitting there today, of course. Quite an attractive building from the outside, spoilt by some later air conditioning additions. But the remarkable thing of the Capitol, of course, was the wonderful ceiling, which is still there today. The capacity's been cut in half, and it ran right through the 20s, 20s and 30s with Paramount, then with Hoyts, then featuring MGM product and Warner Brothers with Silverman and Sharp. Later Village took it on. It ran as an independent, and today it's owned by RMIT. But my favourite of the big picture palaces in central Melbourne is the Forum. Originally the State, it was cut in half in the early 60s to the Forum and the Rapallo. You might remember the Rapallo entrance. Some people didn't even realise that. My laser pointer. The Forum entrance was the State entrance there on Flinders Street, as it is today. But when it was converted into two, there was a new entrance up here on Russell Street, and that was the entrance to the Rapallo, which was the dress circle. The Forum was the stalls. So it was a very clever twinning, a way to make a 3,400 seat theatre viable in the 60s and onwards. The reason I love that one so much is that's where I started. I started there as a 16-year-old assistant projectionist after school, and that's me at about 19, I think. If you believe it's the same person, I can assure you it is. That was just before the 1985 Melbourne Film Festival, and that was in the one of the two projection rooms there. All right, a few more graphs. Sorry, I won't bore you with too many graphs or any more photos of me. Melbourne suburban theatres, let's look at those same dates. 1950, there's 135 individual suburban cinemas. That's from Belgrave to Frankston to Werribee. Doesn't include the Peninsula or Geelong. 1955, the numbers go up slightly, 138. Then 1960, you can see how much devastation just in 4 short years after television. Down to 82, 1965 down to 60. By 1970, there's only 30 suburban cinemas left in Melbourne, and 13 of those were running Greek or Italian films. So you can see it's been totally devastated. Was it all just because of television? No. During that same period, there was the growth of the drive-ins. When you consider the average suburban cinema held approximately 800 to 1,000 people, the average suburban drive-in could hold 700 cars, 3 or 4 people a car. You might have as many as 3,000 customers a night at these suburban drive-ins. So that was the only area of growth in the cinema business in this country, really post-World War II until the 1970s, was the drive-in theatres. You can see they grew from 3 to 12 to 16 to 21, and in fact one more opened after 1970, that was Hoyts at Altona. So the 22 suburban drive-ins were a big part of the business as far as suburban cinema going, and that caused a big effect on the suburban cinemas. They were old. Many of them were 30, 40, 50 years old by this period. The drive-ins were shiny and new. They were in the suburbs. You could go in your car. You could wear your pyjamas. You didn't have to dress up. There was a lot of perceived advantages. You could have a hot meal with the family. So that's another problem for the poor suburban cinemas. But let's get into them. Let's start looking at some of them. The poor old, I call it poor old because that's the Metro Malvern on Glenferrie Road. Originally the Embassy Theatre, MGM took it over as part of their Metro chain. They had theatres in every capital city in Australia, and that was their one suburban cinema in Melbourne. And it's looking a little bit bedraggled there. This shot's from about 1984, 85, going by the film showing, but you can still see on the banners out the front, it's advertising the 31st Melbourne International Film Festival, which ran 2 years prior. So they haven't even bothered taking the advertising down. Would have been expensive to take down and put up. But it was a lovely theatre, the Metro, long lamented. Again, one that was unfortunately demolished with barely a whipper. If it wasn't for a few people like Kevin Adams, John Budge, myself, running around the suburbs taking photos like this, there would be no record of their complete dereliction. And that's the story we're going to see. We're going to see some cinemas survived right through until today. Others, the buildings have survived in other uses, and unfortunately, it's almost the majority of them now were demolished, either right after they stopped showing films or years later as they struggled to find retail tenants. Here's a lovely looking one. It's long since closed. It's still there today. This is in Oakley. This was the Oakley Plaza. And the reason I think it's lovely, it was one of the very few Spanish mission-style cinemas in Australia. Some of you might be familiar with the Roxy Parramatta, which has had an ongoing battle for survival. I really do hope that survives. But here in suburban Melbourne, we had a few Spanish-style suburban cinemas. Hoyt's Regent Gardner was another one. But this one survives today. It was used as squash courts for many years. And you can see that it's a great interior shot of the squash courts being removed. And I think it's just general retail now. There was a travel agency in it when I last saw it. One of two cinemas in Oakley. Unfortunately, the other one, the Oakley Paramount, which survived for many years, continued on as a Greek cinema. Then there was a fire, went over to retail. It's only just in recent years been demolished as well, right next to the overpass. Let's move over to Footscray. Sorry if I'm jumping across the suburbs here, but it's important to include as many parts as possible. The beautiful former Hoyt's Barclay Footscray. Now, you'll see Bingo. That's what kept many of the old cinema buildings intact in England, because Bingo was extremely popular there. It was popular here too, but the moment other forms of gambling came in, Gladys down the street quickly forgot all about Bingo and she was off to the pokies. So, different use. A beautiful big building, one of 4 theatres all operating at the same time in Footscray. The other one being the Hoyt's Trocadero, was the other Hoyt's. The poor old Barclay had a bad night. I think that occurred New Year's Day or New Year's Eve about 1990 when I think I took this photo, and I know John Budge took one at a similar time, but the wind blew down the fly tower at the back of the theatre. So these buildings, if they weren't maintained by a big company like Hoyt's year after year, they crumbled and became derelict. Big buildings require big maintenance, and unfortunately something looks like it's slipped there. Another of the Footscray cinemas was the beautiful Grand. It was cut in half horizontally. Very interesting. You'll see in a few of these buildings that were originally built for other purposes and not cinema, they had their projection rooms tacked on the back as an addition. You can see it hanging off the back there. That was run by Brian Davies, a Footscray legend. And he kept that running right up until the mid-1980s, and it's now used for storage. Wrong way, I knew I'd do it. Again, it turned into a bingo hall for a lot of the 70s, 80s and into the early 90s. The building's still there, Paisley Street. Let's jump across to Canterbury, one of the beautiful Hoyt's expansion cinemas of the late 30s. Art moderne was their style. We refer to them as Art Deco or even Jazz Deco, but it was a beautiful building inside. I heard there'd been a fire, so I went across and had a look. And it still looked fine from the front. I broke in, got into the foyers, past the big barriers, and the foyers looked all right, but unfortunately, the cinema didn't. It had been used as a dance hall, a live music venue after Hoyt's pulled out. But these Hoyt's suburban theatres of the late 30s, the ones they built new or refurbished, had wonderful Art Deco exteriors and interiors. That beautiful buff brick plasterwork inside that was just fabulous, and we'll look at a few more as we go through. Often the less prestigious ones were designed by architects called Cowper, Murphy and Appleford, and the more prestigious ones were designed by an architectural firm called Taylor Solue. So we'll see some of those, but they did some magnificent work. And here's one of the better ones. Again, this building was not very far from here at all. The Hoyt's New Windsor. There was a couple of cinemas in the Windsor area. This was right opposite the train station, and there was 3 or 4 cinemas in Melbourne that had these magnificent ticket boxes. To be honest, they probably weren't very practical, but they looked fantastic. Could you imagine being surrounded by 800 people sitting in a glass ball like that? I'd be terrified. Imagine if you run out of change or something. Help! Studio for a while. Pan Pacific House, that was the film studio that used it, yeah. Still in St Kilda, this is now known as the National, but for decades it was the Hoyt's Victory. Now this is actually originally a black and white. I don't like too many colourised photos, but I thought that whoever did the colouring job on this, I think it's from the Cats Archive, did quite a good job because it really captures the warmth. You can tell that's near the end of its existence. Again, it was a big theatre, 2,500 seats. St Kilda was a real mecca for cinema, and it's showing Cactus Flower and the Age of Consent. That's the Helen Mirren film that was shot up in northern Queensland back in 1969, and I have to laugh, a little aside, it contains some nudity in it with Helen Mirren, and it was quite an avant-garde film for one that was made in Australia at the time. It was pushing some boundaries, and when Columbia decided to team it up as a double feature in the drive-ins, they teamed it up with The Jolson Story. Thought that was an interesting double feature. There we have it, pretty much how it looks today, although this photo I probably took about 30 years ago. National, still there, well used. Again, it's been cut in half horizontally, still has a decent capacity, but they used it for studios, I think dance studios underneath and some retail. The well-known Astor, which we know so well, that the great George Florence kept running after its Greek cinema days, ended. And I should point out that Greek cinema, and to a lesser extent Italian cinema and some other foreign language cinemas, we would not have the survivors today that we have without Greek cinema. Michael Protopapas here with us tonight, and his family, the Yanudis family, were the mainstays of Greek cinema, and probably solely responsible for about half the surviving heritage cinemas today that we have, because they just would not have survived otherwise. That's an interior shot of the Astor just when George Florence had started to do some renovations. It's a dirty slide, but it gives you some idea of how much work he did to renovate that place over the years. Today it's run by Palace Cinemas, and still going strong, and it's just about the only single screen cinema in a capital city in Australia. One or two in Adelaide, not many others. So if you want to experience what cinema was like back years ago, the Astor was a good place to go. Here's one that was very well loved. The Hoyts Regent South Yarra, well known for their supper shows and a very flamboyant manager and some very flamboyant staff, I should point out. Just around the corner in Toorak Road it was in South Yarra, opposite side of the street to where the Longford was later built. But that's a fantastic shot showing the red and blue Hoyts neon, which almost every one of their suburban cinemas had. The Sydney Hoyts neons were slightly different to the Melbourne ones. Melbourne had a few variations, but that was probably the most common one. Again, this is a great shot taken towards the end. I can see Oliver is showing there, so it must be into the late 60s. Hoyts finally closed it in the early 70s. A fire occurred just before the National Theatre were looking to take it on, and it was demolished. Very sad loss. Does anyone know where this one is? Stumps a lot of people. It's obviously been done up as a video store in the 1980s. This was the Werribee Palais. Unless you were in Werribee, you would not know of this place. It recently come up again for sale. I think Cash Converters are the major tenant in it. But it just shows you, even some of the outer suburbs, and believe me, Werribee was an outer suburb in the 40s and 50s, it was a very lovely theatre. I have seen photos of it inside. So not all of these outlying suburbs had those little 400-seat plain Jane halls, but we'll look at some of them later anyway. The magnificent Hoyts Regent Thornbury, it's still sitting there today. It's a live music venue after years as a reception centre. Ironically, just across the road, 1 block away, is Gus Berger's Thornbury Picture House, which holds about a 20th of what the magnificent Regent Thornbury used to hold. But it was part of the Hoyts Regency release circuit in the 50s and 60s. So a film would open at the Regent Theatre in Collins Street in the city, and they'd splash it at the same time in the same week to their prestige suburban cinemas, the Padua Brunswick, Regent South Yarra, Regent Thornbury. Beautiful big building, still with the old Hoyt sign sitting at the top there, as it stayed there right through the 80s. Its facade has been freshened up, but it's still there, luckily. Wrong way, David. Carlton Movie House, one of my favourite little places. Now, this is one of Melbourne's smallest suburban cinemas. For most of its life, the building was actually owned by the Royal Women's Hospital. It was a former hall that became a cinema. For many decades, it was run by the late, great Gordon McClelland. Some of you would remember Gordon. I actually worked with his son at Greater Union, who was also a projectionist. But that's how it used to be. And I loved the feel. It was like a New York. If you've ever been to a New York theatre, particularly in the 80s or before, you'd buy your tickets on the street. You had these great big cast iron shutters at the front, no foyer to speak of. You just went straight into the stalls or up to the little dress circle. But it was a fantastic place to discover cinema, particularly in the 60s, 70s and 80s. Great innovative double features, some really out there films around there, didn't they, Alan? It was a place that I discovered lots of cinema, from Marilyn Monroe to Woody Allen and everything in between. After Gordon McClelland got out of the cinema, it was run by Greg Kavanagh, Paul Coulter, John Freeman, and then unfortunately closed. Still sitting there in Faraday Street, it's retail. That's how it looked about a decade later. They'd actually built a small foyer at the front by this stage. And again, you can see part of the little Biobox projection room protruding at the front of the facade. Beautiful little theatre. I just wish they'd fixed that Ratley heater. Being there trying to concentrate on some French film and a big heater hanging down in the middle of the ceiling was rattling every time it came on. Now here's a favourite of mine and a favourite of many Melburnians. It's unique for a number of reasons. It's Hoyt's New Malvern, corner of Glenferrie Road and Dandenong Road. Sat there for years. When I worked there, I'm thinking this is a pretty old theatre and it's called the Hoyt's New Malvern. How old was the old Malvern? Well, I found out it was still sitting around the corner, the old Victory Malvern, which opened before. But New Malvern opened in 1924, a beautiful large theatre, and interestingly, Hoyt's decided, despite it running right up until early 1987, Hoyt's decided not to modernise this facade. So it looks like a 1920s building, it always did. I'm not sure why it escaped the Art Deco smooth-overs they did in the 30s or the modernisation. It was updated inside, but not externally. One of the reasons I enjoyed working at this theatre so much as a projectionist, sorry I should have mentioned that, but I was an assistant projectionist, then projectionist before getting into various other roles, is the projection room. Now that was the projection room window up there with the air conditioner, and particularly on Friday and Saturday nights across the road was the Nicobella's nightclub. You'd watch all the guys and girls line up and all the goings on from my little window in the projection room up there. Great old theatre, really enjoyed working there. There it is at night, lit up. That photo, believe it or not, was taken whilst I was actually working there, and the reason I know is because it's got Crocodile Dundee and Karate Kid 2, which I was running there in mid-1986. But these places literally closed without even a whimper. They just disappeared before our eyes, and it took some time for the hurt and the ache and the memories to kick in. And now you mention Hoyt's Malvern to an audience that remembers it, and wow, they really miss it, particularly given the ugly building that replaced it. That was the interior. I can tell someone's left the backstage door open because those curtains are billowing with the air that would rush in. Nice big CinemaScope screen added. Of course, the original screen and proscenium were much smaller prior to 1954-55 when CinemaScope was added. This shot is from the 1980s. It still had old world charm, but it was comfortable, and it had those cast iron foot warmers. Any of you remember the foot warmers? You put your feet on them in the cinema and they have oil flowing through them. Yeah, fantastic place to work. But down it came. Heartbreaking. You shouldn't have taken so many of these shots, John. You're upsetting everyone. Again, I had a shot taken at the same time. When I was putting this presentation together, I used a lot of my photos and had photos of a particular theatre at a particular time. Then I'd look at the one that John took, and his was better than mine, so I used his photo instead. Anyway, fantastic to capture this happening, for better or worse. Now, only a couple of theatres were built brand new in Melbourne after World War II. There was building restrictions in the late 40s and early 50s, so even though they wanted to build new cinemas, they couldn't get the materials. And finally, when those restrictions were lifted, it was getting very close to television starting. But a couple of brave souls decided that they would build a beautiful 1,000-seat cinema in the 1950s style in Reservoir, replacing the old Plaza Reservoir, and this is what became known as Cinema North. This is from the opening program. It was my local cinema. I grew up in Reservoir and loved spending my days at Cinema North. That's how it looked in later years, 1980s, with the big village sign. A screen was added out the back, the smaller. That VistaVision sign doesn't refer to the Hollywood process of VistaVision, it refers to the video store that opened in half of the foyer. I don't know what Andrew Catley was thinking back then. He was trying to have a foot in both camps, but I remember lining up along the footpath for films like Hugo the Hippo, Heidi, Mad Adventures in Russia, lining up all on the footpath here, and the manager, Andrew Catley, walking along with the sign, plonking it just in front or behind me, and it said, "Sorry, house full." So if you were on the other side of that sign, you had to walk back home, and that hurt. I bugged Andrew Catley, the manager there, who was also the projectionist of it as well, could I please have a look at the projection room? And got told no about 3 times as a 10-year-old, 12-year-old and a 14-year-old. Guess what happened 30 years later? Andrew Catley was working for me. Do you think I ever let him forget that? Oh no. I reminded him frequently. Any wonder he moved to Tasmania. There's a shot of the foyer. Very comfortable. It pretty much looked like that in the 1970s when I was going, probably the same couches. And there it is in its last days, all seats $5. Why all of a sudden did it fall on hard times and close? A little thing called the multiplex. So some of these places that had struggled on all the way through, all of a sudden you got Hoyt-Saint Northland 5 minutes away, and these poor old single and twin screen locations just could not survive. They couldn't compete. The main auditorium, that beautiful large one, has been demolished, but the foyer and the additional cinema that was added are both still there intact. So. Moving further up High Street, the old Preston Planet, corner of Planky Road and High Street, just where it splits. It was there for years, and I should be pointing out to you, you're already seeing it with your own eyes, but all the different ways these cinema buildings survived. How they enabled the building to keep going when cinema didn't. So this became Ace Auto Accessories, was there for years, but when those uses fell away, when these become 80-year-old buildings, they were very easy to demolish, and now there's a 12-storey block of apartments on that block. Now, further up along High Street, this is just in Thornbury, between the Planet and the one we looked at before, the Regent Thornbury. Now, this doesn't look like a cinema, but I can assure you it is. It looks like 5 shop fronts that have been joined together from the front, but from above, you can clearly see the Hoyt's, sorry, not, it wasn't Hoyt's, the Rio Cinema. It's this big building here, there are those shop fronts, there was the entrance, and it's been used for a myriad of uses since that time. Closed in the 1930s, we don't even know whether it actually converted to sound. So it dates back to the silent days, but it's been sitting here silently in High Street, Thornbury, with hardly anyone recognising it or knowing about it for all these years, and it's still there today.
What's it called?
It was the Rio, Thornbury Rio Cinema.
In High Street?
High Street, Thornbury. Also in Preston, this is Plenty Road, and it's a shot of a tram rather than as a cinema, but it's a very rare shot of the Melody Cinema, which was previously the Gowerville, run by Sid and Verna Guest. Many of these independent cinemas were run by small chains. Mums and dads, their family worked in the cinemas. It's how Village started, Rock Kirby with Kirby Theatres. That's what they did. They were running cinemas in the early 1930s. But this is one of the only shots, particularly in colour, of the Melody Theatre. It was demolished very early on, but Preston had 6 cinemas, all open at the same time, all competing against each other. There's Sid Guest, who I mentioned. I got to interview his wife, Verna, before she passed away about 35, maybe 40 years ago now. He used to love playing the organ, and what was unusual, this is in his Preston West Rivoli Theatre, which is still there in Gilbert Road. It's actually for sale today if you want to buy it. He used to play the organ and then run up and run the projectors. He was the projectionist as well. And my grandma said he always played the same song. I think it was called Floating Down the River or something like that. There it is. That's had a little bit of work done to it. There's very few, in fact I don't think any photos I know of it when it was open, but it used to have a lolly shop in the front like many of them did. Pretty plain Jane, but pretty typical of a Melbourne suburban cinema. That's how it looked in the 1980s. It looks similar to that today. And if you ever wander in there and find that one of the exit signs is missing, it's in my shed, and no, you can't have it back. Further up High Street, here's another fantastic example of these Hoyt's late 30s expansion cinemas. Radio was the thing that was going to knock suburban cinemas first of all in the 20s. Well, radio didn't have any impact, but the Depression certainly did. And in Australia, well into the 30s, cinema audiences really lagged. And it wasn't until the mid-1930s that those numbers came back, and then the companies had to build these new places. And the Hoyt Circle Preston was just an amazing place. Pretty typical mid-range suburban theatre, but wow, they spent some money on it. I'm not sure whether you can see, but it's advertising the row, so it's probably just converted to CinemaScope. This would have been about 1954. But let's look inside. It was just fantastic. You know, imagine these places built, you know, in suburbs all over Melbourne. Stadium style means they don't have a full balcony on 2 levels. The expensive seats, if you like, are just slightly raised. They're not actually on a balcony. It was more affordable to build cinemas like this. The Sun Yarraville was also built that way. But just fantastic. Look at that plasterwork. Survived for a few years. Was a nightclub venue. People danced, live bands, well into the 60s, but it was demolished. And now a pretty orphan looking, I think it's called the Circle Arcade there on High Street, Preston, replaced it. We're now in Clifton Hill, the late lamented Cinema Italia. The foyer is still there. Most of everything you see is still there, but unfortunately, that's what happened to the cinema. They wrecked it out, still a screen and speakers sitting there. But it was probably the home, along with a few others like Ascot Vale, but the home of Italian cinema in Melbourne. Many films from Hollywood studios were run there with subtitles. Some were dubbed, but they also ran Italian films, particularly from Palumbo. Frank and his father were the distributors of Italian films. They were located in North Melbourne. But yeah, pretty inglorious end to what was a lovely cinema. Actually opened by Archbishop Mannix in 1911. And I think the plaque is still in the foyer, or it should be. But yeah, demolished.
It's not in your garage?
No, the plaque isn't in my garage. Shut up, Keith. Now here's a question I'll throw out to the audience. This, I think, is one of the most untouched survivors of a suburban cinema in Melbourne, and it's sitting like this today. This photo was taken last year. Does anyone know where it is?
Coburg Town Hall?
Coburg Town Hall, thank you, John. This is still sitting there today. Now, yes, it was a town hall, but it actually ran as a cinema from 1930. Hoyts took it on as they needed an overflow house in 1935. So it was run as a Hoyt suburban cinema right through the late 30s, through the boom years of the war in the 40s, and they closed it, I think, in the early 50s. But those seats are still there today, just like that. Amazing to think that has survived, because you won't see that in too many other places around. There it is. Coburg Town Hall. The Liberty in Brunswick. This is Lygon Street, 499 Lygon Street. The reason I know is because I used to do some relief projection shifts there back in the 1980s. It had a reincarnation. It was called the Galaxy for many years. There was an infamous police raid there, and I won't tell you what they found. It was used as a R-rated sex cinema, live strippers, Italian sex films. Everything happened at the Liberty and the Galaxy. But it turned to legitimacy, I should say, in the years that I was there. It was run by various people that tried to resurrect it. It looks quite plain. The building is still there today, but inside it was just a wonderful step back to the 1950s. That's a shot when it was having a minor refurbishment in the 1980s, but those grates or grills each side of the screen, they had coloured lights, and as the trailers were running, as you're leading up to the feature, we just slowly pull those lights down. It was like the sun setting. It was just a wonderful little suburban flea pit that has survived through all these generations and is still there today. I think it's in use as a club. I'm not sure what sort of social club it is, but it was also a factory for a while as well. But again, it survived thanks to Greek cinema. There's the poor, lamented Valhalla, Richmond, the former Victoria Street, Victoria Theatre in Victoria Street, Richmond. Who remembers going to the Valhalla, Richmond, seeing the Blues Brothers or whatever? Absolutely. It looked pretty tumbled down there from the exterior, but it really did pioneer the way that you could run alternative film, retro films, all sorts of films. Their calendars were just fantastic. On the back of every toilet door in every share house in Melbourne. 6 months, great programming. Barry Peake, Chris Kiley, later John Rouse, all involved in running this fantastic institution in Melbourne. And they also, Chris Kiley moved to Sydney and opened one in Glebe as well. But wow, look at those films. Everything from Hitchcock's Vertigo to Koyanis Katsi to the Pope of Greenwich Village. Fantastic days. But it too met a very sad end. The lease ended and the Valhalla had to come down, and it's just been replaced by some retail shops or a small supermarket now. Wonderful feel inside. It was a flea pit for sure, but it had a wonderful feel. Great place to see a movie, particularly in those days. As a young kid, I could catch the train up from Reservoir, walk down Victoria Street, and they would run their Saturday matinees were $1. You got cartoons and features and all sorts of things. But thankfully the Valhalla lived on. They moved to the West Garth, which of course is still there today. I've taken many shots of the West Garth Theatre over the years, as have some other people here. But why I like this shot so much is it features the Bluesmobile. Who remembers the famous Bluesmobile, the Dodge Phoenix, dressed up as the Bluesmobile for the Blues Brothers movie, of course. It used to drive Greater Union mad, who released the film initially at the Forum in 1980. It did a few weeks and disappeared. Valhalla got hold of the Blues Brothers and made a mint. Every Friday night, the place was packed. For years, Greater Union to bring it back into the city where I was working. We try and run it, we get 7 people to see it. On at the Valhalla that Friday night, packed with 1,000. So Greater Union gave up trying to run that film and just left it to the Valhalla then. And it continued successfully there at the West Garth for some years. Then the two Michaels ran it for some time, and then Palace came in. And whilst it's still got a lot of its charm, it's now 5 auditoriums inside that building. The Burnley Theatre in Richmond, still sitting there today as Swan Auctions, as auction rooms. Unfortunately, all that beautiful lattice work interior that was there up until a few years ago has been ripped out. Again, it was magnificent to see that, and now it's just a stripped out box, unfortunately. Let's have a look at some of the ads in the newspapers. This is 1957. So the effects of television are just being felt. People are buying TVs. There's the Hoyts. This isn't Hoyts City Theatres. This is just, I know it's too small, this is just the Hoyts Suburban Cinemas. And then it's got a few of their first drive-ins down here. Next one. Then there was the first of 2 independent circuits. This was the Suburban Cinemas. This was another competing chain of independent cinemas. Preston Planet there, Preston Melody, 2 we looked at already. And then there was a 3rd suburban circuit called regional theatres, which were another grouping of independents to advertise in this block. And you can see the drive-ins have started opening there. Panoramic Drive-In, where was that one? Cranbourne Road, vaguely rings a bell. That's an in-joke. We used to own that drive-in. So again, the drive-ins were starting to encroach even before the cinemas really hit the skids. But these places went from full houses on a Saturday night with 1,500 people. Within a few years, they could hardly get 30 people to some of those peak sessions. There's an old story I used to say when I was working at the Forum in the city even, and it had pretty hard times if we didn't have a film like E.T. or Back to the Future. And a customer rang one night and spoke to the manager, "What time's the show on tonight?" And the manager replied, "What time can you get here?" Let's look at some little cinemas. Not only the big cinemas survived, some of these little cinemas survived. And many of these little theatres did not advertise in the papers. They only advertised locally. The Coburg West Progress really only started showing up in the Herald by the late 60s. But these places were in existence over and above those lists I just showed you in the newspapers, and I'll show you a few of them. So the Coburg West Progress was fantastic, run for many years by some people that just loved cinema. And it looks pretty plain. Reynard Street, Coburg, is only about 11 feet wide. It's a narrow street if you haven't been there. But wow, inside, it was just fantastic. It was a real treat, one of Melbourne's undiscovered secrets. I remember the first time I went into this place, I thought, hang on, did I just step inside the Chelsea in Flinders Street? This is incredible. Out here in the suburbs, it's now used as a dance studio, I think, unfortunately. But it survived right up until late 90s, early 2000s. Now there's one that's a little less than salubrious. That hall at the back was the Preston West Progress. So these Progress halls converted to cinemas, and they were often overflow houses or secondary cinemas. This was again run by Sid Guest. Later on, that building was built in the front. It became a table tennis centre. But you know, these places ran not necessarily every night, but every weekend they would be running films, and they were all around the suburbs. Anyone know where this one is? Edith Vale, excellent. Yeah, the Edith Vale Unity. Look at that beautiful little Art Deco facade there. Lovely little cinema. It still sits there today. Hasn't been a cinema since the 50s. I think it's up for redevelopment at the moment, and I have fears that it may be demolished because it's been sold with a number of surrounding plots of land. But wouldn't that have been a great place? Backs right onto the beach there at Edith Vale. Here's another one. It says Centenary Hall up the top, but from opening in 1934, it was the East Malvern Vern Cinema. In fact, shortly after it was the East Malvern Vern, it opened as the Rex Talkies. There's an old sounding name. And it ran under the shadow of the bigger cinemas in Malvern and East Malvern. The Waverley Cinema was further up the road in East Malvern. It was a beautiful place. And this place closed even before television started. So these smaller places couldn't compete, but it survived. You can see it was a post office and Onyx knitwear. So the auditorium was used as a factory. There's a post office in the front. This photo taken about 35, 40 years ago. And that's pretty much how it looks today. Again, a dress shop in the front, hairdressers, Pilates studio, various uses. So these buildings have survived, hidden. This was no Padua, this was no Regent South Yarra, but this is a place where people saw the same films that they could see maybe a year later, but they were everywhere, particularly in the outer suburbs. Nunawading, Doncaster, Thomastown, they all received these smaller cinemas right through the 30s, 40s and 50s, and they didn't advertise in the daily papers. We recognise that one, but a few of us got to take some photos long before the Sun Yarraville was renovated. That's how it was when I first found the foyer. If you know what it looks like today, it's an incredible change that Mike Smith and the guys have done out there with the Sun. Again, I think it's now, is it 8 or 9 auditoriums? I've lost count. But Mike and the crew does a fantastic job running the Sun Yarraville, a real survivor. And it doesn't look beautiful now. Here's another survivor. It might say Brighton Bay Twin, and today it's the Palace Brighton 4 Cinema Complex on Bay Street. It was originally the Hoyts Centre Brighton. Has another interesting history with Hoyts. After they closed it as a cinema, they needed somewhere to store all their old projectors that they were pulling out of these cinemas they were closing, because they still needed projectors and seats and everything else. So this became the Hoyts store. So right through the 60s and 70s, this is where Hoyt stored all their old projectors and seats. It was renovated and done up as a twin cinema about 1980, and along with the Rivoli Camberwell was one of the premium art houses in Melbourne. Betty Blue, Diva, all these French classics, all these great foreign films. It was run by Mike and Maria Walsh. Mike Walsh had a deal with Hoyt's Distribution called Hoyt's Premium Films, and he would get first release and exclusive release on these films. So it was very strong business right through the 80s and 90s. Today it's run by Palace and you can still go, but the shell of the building survives about 100 years. It's been sitting there. This is Balwyn, still there today. This is in its village years. It looks like it just had a fresh coat of paint. It's had many screens added. Of course, it was an original single screen theatre. That's how it looks today. Again, a real survivor. Always a cinema, ran right through as a cinema. So we're looking at ones that have survived as cinemas through the whole period. The classic Elston Week, I think this is during the days when Russell O'Regan, the late great Russell O'Regan, was running it. An ex-village person, he took it on for quite a few years. Then Eddie Tamir and Reading Cinemas took it on, and today it's run by Eddie Tamir and his family. Again, it's no longer a single screen. I think it's up to 11 screens sitting there today, so you can still visit. It closed a number of times. It was a dance hall for a while. A few different uses, but it kept coming back to cinema. Another survivor, the Cameo Belgrave, was sitting out there, out in the sticks. It was the gateway to all the hills cinemas, and there was many of them. Upway, all those places had their own little cinemas, but the Cameo was a little bit bigger and better. That's how it looks today, same building. And uniquely with the Cameo, that has happened very rarely, its main auditorium, the original one, which just looks lovely there, taken in the 1940s, still survives today. So that I took that photo just 3 or 4 weeks ago with a session I saw there. They've added cinemas along next to it, above it, behind it, but the main auditorium is intact, and that rarely happens. Now, I'm not going to come right up to the multiplex era, but after the 1960s, Hoyt's Cinema Centre opened 1969, Hoyt's Mid-City 1970, and the Village Track Cinema in 1969, one of the first new suburban theatres that opened. It replaced the Toorak Village Theatre, which wasn't owned by Village. It was an independent cinema. It just happened that Village took over the Track Cinema, which was built on the side of the Track Centre there. I'm not sure whether the nightclub is still going, but eventually Silver's nightclub took it over. You can see this was taken about 25 years ago. Again, the track was 70mm equipped. People would lie on the carpet under the screen, in front of the screen, and watch 2001: A Space Odyssey, and took the ultimate trip, if you know what I mean. But the track was a great place to see a film. Innovative programming by Village, thank you, Alan. And saw many films there. I remember my car broke down once on the way to driving there. When I got my driver's licence, I was tempted to leave the car and jump on the tram to go to the cinema, but I thought I'd stay with the car. But I still got to the start of the session. That's it inside. Smaller than the big theatres, the suburban theatres, but it was a 500-seater, very lovely auditorium. Ran in its last days by Palace, but prior to that, Alan Simpson and the late great Robert Ward. Again, still a great place to see films right up until the end. So these newer cinemas, so we're getting suburban cinemas finally growing from 1970 onwards. The Village Suburban Twins are coming. Hoyt's opened a new twin at Waverley Gardens, so things are slowly starting to come up from that, low point in 1970. Another one that Village built, the Village Twin at Frankston. At one stage, Village Frankston was the busiest suburban location in Australia. It and Parramatta in the Sydney suburbs were also very busy, so the audiences were slowly coming back to the suburbs if you built the right theatres in the right place. And although it's looking a bit bedraggled there, I worked as a projectionist at Frankston for quite a while. They were beautiful theatres, very nice, comfortable. These are very similar to the ones, the twin that was built at Doncaster. The ones at Boronia and Croydon were a little narrower, a bit more pokey, but the ones at Frankston, 1 and 2, were great. The other 2 cinemas they built across the road, cinemas 3 and 4, were not quite as nice. That's the other cinema of the Frankston Twin. Beautiful, big screens, lovely auditoriums, good picture sound, any wonder people came back. Okay, let's get a bit of perspective as we nearly get to the end. That's the same slide or graph you saw before, with a slight change. People ask me, where are we at today? So we're jumping forward from 1970 all the way to 2025. We got down to 30 cinemas in 1970. Today in Melbourne there are 437 cinema screens in that same area, spread across 50 locations. Do you think you could probably get in your lifetime to all 437 auditoriums? In fact, I forgot one. I forgot to add Acme in there, so it's actually 438 is the count today. And that's the official count from the ratings agency. So often cinemas don't advertise how many screens they've actually got, and it's hard to work out, but that was as of a month ago, and there's two more screens about to open soon, but I can't really talk about those. And that's the end of our presentation. We will have some questions, but when people say to me, David, I want to go to the cinema today, where should I go? I say, well, the Rivoli is fantastic, Balwyn, Sun Yarraville, the Lido, there's many of these places, but if you want to see a modern multiplex that I think does it right, this is the Reading complex at Altona North. It's called Miller's Junction. It's at the back of a shopping centre with fast food restaurants. I know it's probably out of the way for a lot of you, but I drive from my home to visit good cinemas like this because it's just so nice. Big screens, quality picture and sound, comfortable seats, it's a lovely foyer. You can have a beer, a coffee, some snacks in the theatre, but that's what's keeping cinema relevant today. People are shocked when I tell them that Melbourne has 438 individual auditoriums. By the way, that's 80 more than Sydney. Melbourne's cinema growth has been very strong over the recent years. It still needs to come back a little bit from pre-COVID, but it's very strong. So there's a cinema near you, and as I tell people, it's great to experience different movies, but the next time you go, why don't you try and experience a different cinema? Guarantee there's another one within 15 minutes from you that you probably haven't been or sampled before. Give it a go. The service might be better, might have good coffee, might be a different experience. Even if you don't like it and go back to your favourite one, at least you've experienced something different. So I hope it hasn't been all doom and gloom. Thank you for being an attentive audience today. Thanks very much.